Hello and welcome to Teddy Tuts, brought to you by London Cyber School. Please note that the copyright of this material is vested in London Cyber School Limited and all our rights are reserved. We are going to deal with avoiding plagiarism in academic writing, a very important issue across all academic study. Firstly, what is plagiarism? The Oxford Dictionary defines plagiarism as the practice of taking someone else's work or ideas and passing them off as one's own. The Merriam-Webster dictionary definition is to use the words or ideas of another person as if they were your own words or ideas. Now, according to Cottrell, these include using words more or less exactly as they've been used in articles, lectures, television programs, books, or anywhere else. Now, the important point to note is more or less. In other words, not necessarily exactly as they were used by the person that created them in the first instance, but if they are close enough, it's considered plagiarism. Next, using other people's ideas or theories without saying whose ideas they are. That is the key issue. If you use material from someone else, it is not plagiarism if you say that this material comes from someone else. And paraphrasing what you read or hear without stating where it comes from. In other words, it's not good enough to paraphrase in your own words without making reference to the fact that these ideas or words were the origin of someone else's work. So what is the big issue with plagiarism in academic writing? Well, the first and probably the most important point is that it helps us to build knowledge in a field by referring to other people's work. It enables us to investigate work already done by others in the field. It helps us support or contrast our findings in our own work. It helps us to rule out doing research where it has already been done. And very importantly, it helps us develop new research opportunities. We need to be aware of the forms of plagiarism. The first is the most common, duplication of others' work. The classical copy and pasting. Next, paraphrasing another person's work without referencing it. It is right that we require students to paraphrase. Paraphrasing does not exonerate you from making reference to the fact that you've used someone else's work or ideas as the basis of your writing. It is equally wrong to take a number of authors' work and piece it together in sections. And we will see this later on, where bits and pieces have been put together as if they are one's own work. But the origin of those bits and pieces are others' work. That's plagiarism. And then, surprisingly, students do not recognize that if they've done a piece of work already, they've had the marks for that work, and therefore it is plagiarism if you do not reference your own prior work. And the age-old working together problem, where students work together without authorization. Let's dig a little deeper into this question of group work. Now, often group work is part of your assessment, and if a single piece of work needs to be submitted by a group of students, that is not plagiarism, but one needs to be careful that only one piece of work is submitted with all of your names or student numbers referenced on that single piece of work. Under those conditions, group work is not plagiarism. There's a process of legitimate collaboration, And this is where constructive education or intellectual practice aims to facilitate or enhance learning. If you're using work that is common to all of your output, it needs to be referenced as such. When it is referenced, it is not plagiarism. So what is collusion? Collusion is unauthorized collaboration, and it involves working together with others without permission to produce work, which is then presented as work completed independently by a single student. The moment that occurs, it is plagiarism. So, how is plagiarism detected? Well, in these modern days, we use software to assist us in detecting plagiarism. But plagiarism is a manual process. What we need to do is to establish whether or not the work presented by the student is their own work, or whether they have derived the ideas or the words from somewhere else. If another person had originally developed the work, and it is presented in the student's work, it is plagiarism unless it is properly referenced. Now, Turnitin uses a mechanism of determining similarity between one piece of work and others. And so it generates, as a guide, a percentage similarity. That is intended to give the lecturer an indication of the extent to which the student's work is similar to other people's work. But that is not plagiarism. Plagiarism, I will repeat again, is the use of other people's ideas or work or words and presenting them as if they are your own. The moment you reference someone else's work properly, it is not plagiarism. So please remember, there is no such thing as percentage plagiarism. It simply does not exist. There is percentage similarity to give us an indication of how similar a particular student's work is to others, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the concept of plagiarism. Plagiarism, as we've said before, is where other people's ideas, words, or work is presented as if the student had done the work themselves. So, let's have a look at a few examples. The first is that we have a percentage similarity in Turnitin. And what it is trying to do is to give us an indication of how similar this piece of work is to others. And if you look down the list, you will see that there are a number of sources that the work is similar with. So 1% of this work is similar to this internet source. Yeah? Another 1% is similar to the World Bank website. Here we have work submitted to another university. Another particular student's piece of work has a 1% similarity. So what Turnitin is doing is scanning the external environment and comparing that to the student's own piece of work. Now let's try and determine this in terms of plagiarism. What we see here is a table constructed by the student with no external reference at all. And as we work through this, we can see that that piece of work has been almost word for word derived from source number 51. That is plagiarism because that piece of work was not developed by the student himself. In fact, here we see 13 represented 3 times in this table. And this work, with minor word changes or possibly spelling changes, is plagiarism because it is not referenced. And we see it again. 26, another source. Here, another source, 41. So what we see is that this student has assembled a number of ideas from other people's work and presented it in a table without referencing them. The fact that it's not referenced makes this a plagiarized piece of work. So it is important to remember that in every case, wherever you take material from someone else, even if it's fragments like you see here in this table, you need to reference the source. Here we can see that the student has in fact referenced it, but not correctly. It is very important to use a recognized referencing system. Nonetheless, the student has, to some extent, tried to paraphrase what they've done here, but it's badly done. The key words that are being used are still the words of the World Bank. Here we have a situation where the student has taken a table from somewhere else, and even though there appears to be some reference of a source, what the student should have done is provide their own reference of the actual source where they've taken this table from. The source that's ringed in red is a source provided by the original author of this work, and it is not the student's reference to a particular source as such. In fact, the words rating agencies is not an actual source as such. It's too ambiguous. Here we see a situation where the student has taken the words verbatim from a source. This is very clearly someone else's work and has not been properly referenced. Here we have a situation where the student has constructed a bibliography, and we see in the very early stages of this that they are in fact identical to other people's work. And in the case of a bibliography, if it is done correctly, it will be identical and is therefore not plagiarism. The same applies to a mathematical sum, where the process and the answer, if done correctly, will be identical to everyone else's performance of that same piece of work. In accounting, or wherever we've got numbers, there is a correct answer, and where there's a correct answer, it cannot be construed as plagiarism. However, if you copy the exact same example used by someone else, that constitutes plagiarism. But back to this page, bibliography of this nature, or reference lists, if done correctly, will be identical to the bibliography or reference list of someone else. Good. Now we're on to our second example, where we see the similarity count is 25%. But when we look at the list, we see that it is broken down into very small percentages with chunks originating from various sources of similarity. So even though we have a 25% similarity count, we cannot say that this is a plagiarized piece of work. All we can say is that 1/4 of this piece of work is similar to other work externally. So let's have a look at parts of it. Here we see small fragments of the work from others incorporated. But in each case, we can see that this work here, for example, is only part of a sentence. And if it is continually small components like this, or fragments, then it's up to the judgment of the assessor to determine whether or not it's material enough to be construed as plagiarism. What is important is that in this case, the student has been careful to indicate the source of the graphic, so not masquerading as if this graphic was generated by themselves. Here we see a list of references. If it is correctly referenced, the similarity will be identical or very similar to other sources. Now we're going to deal with a case where we have a 38% similarity count. Now that is very high, and on the surface would appear that the student has copied more than a third of the work from elsewhere. What we do find, however, is that 9% has come from a particular source, number one. And we're going to deal with that particular source next. Here we see number one source as the virtual construct of this entire table. While this has not been specifically referenced, if the student wanted to avoid any criticism whatsoever, at the bottom of this table, the specific source would have been reflected. When we use Turnitin, it's entirely up to us as assessors to look at the work and to determine whether or not the student has used work of others and not referenced it correctly. The key skill that we use is observation. If we're not sure, we're entitled to resort to alternative methods of determining whether or not the work was constructed by the student themselves or not. Some institutions use interviews to establish whether or not the student had in fact constructed the work themselves or whether they had acquired the work elsewhere. A more formal approach is the viva voce, and this is oral evidence of your knowledge and understanding of the work that you've produced. And so there is no one way of determining whether or not a piece of work is the student's own work or not. There are various techniques that we use. So how can you avoid plagiarism? Well, reference. Reference everything appropriately. You need to use in-text citation sparingly and correctly. Remember, only your words count in terms of marks. So the more you encroach on your word count with others' work, the less space there is for you to gather marks. Similarly, and very importantly, keep quotations to a minimum. Avoid copying and pasting from sources. It is far too risky to copy and paste this information into your document. Paraphrasing is very important in the process of incorporating others' work into your own. You often need to summarize, and as always, again and again, no matter whether you paraphrase, summarize, or quote, reference the work. You read and use the paraphrasing and summarizing techniques that are available in the Teddy Tut videos. Then, reference. When in doubt, reference. Don't allow your friends to copy your work. This is an essential guideline. Protect your work if you're working in a public space, and that's often in a library or where others may have access to your documentation. Even in your room where friends and family will visit, protect your work. In a nutshell, reference others' work always, and you cannot be accused of plagiarism. I hope that this has been of assistance to you. Good luck. Goodbye.